Welcome back, everyone, to the Athens Democracy Forum. My name is Mete Coban, and welcome to our version of a Democracy Cafe to discuss how young people could trust politics. Usually, we would do this in a cafe, as it's called, a Democracy Cafe, and you would see me with a Starbucks coffee, but today you'll see me having some water, so we'll call it Democracy Water for today. But I'm very pleased to be joined by Alexia to the right of me, and we've also got Ines, and we're also joined virtually today by Sebnem, Abba, and also Diana, who will be joining us directly from London, where we're going to be discussing how we can rebuild politics to make sure that it works for young people, but also make sure that we actually listen to young people's voices about how they want to build trust and what they want to see from their decision makers and politicians. As I say, the Democracy Cafe model is a partnership that we've been working with the Athens Democracy Forum for some time now. You would have heard the presentation on disinformation, and it was part of a project that we've done together. And this will be a short 35-minute showcase of what a Democracy Cafe would look like. Now, we know the issue of trust is a big one in politics, particularly for young people. We always say that young people do care about the issues that affect them, but the problem is whether they see traditional forms of politics as a vehicle to address the issues they care about. I've got some stark statistics with me today, which show that 67% of young people who live in the UK do not trust either political institutions or their politicians. 15% have no opinion about it, and only a very small percentage of young people in the UK trust politics. So it's going to be an interesting conversation. So firstly, let me start by saying thank you and welcome to our panelists who are joining us here today. So we're going to kick this off in rounds, and the way we're going to do it is we've got a set of questions where our young panelists will be able to answer to those questions. So, Alexia, if I may start with you, what do you think are the biggest obstacles that stop young people from engaging in politics?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having us here. I would say that obviously young people have lost trust in institutions and specifically in democracy. Now, that cannot be easily justified, but first of all, we can say that politics are projected to young people as a means of corruption. They do not believe in the transparency and the almost honesty that politics should at least represent. Also, they believe that they don't represent them. They believe politicians do not represent them. They do not see youth participating in politics, or at least in formal politics. So they do feel like politics is not a matter that has to do with them. There are obviously social, cultural, and ethnic differences that also influence this opinion, but it is definitely a matter that has many aspects to it.
Great. Thank you very much, Alexia. And Abba, if I can come to you, if you can hear me, what would you say? Would you say that young people are interested about politics, or would you say that they kind of feel disillusioned from the way things are working?
I definitely think young people are more interested in politics. There's a new form of politics now, and that's through social media. So young people are able to be more vocal about what kind of change they want to see. But I definitely think that there's become more of a distrust in government. So now young people are seeing, I would say, a different forms of resistance by actually going online and saying, this is what I want to campaign about, and this is the change I actually want to see. You know, young people are agents of change, so it's very important for us to have that kind of clarity. And I do like to see a lot of young people engaging in politics, which I think they are trying to do now.
Amazing. Thank you very much for your contribution, Abba. And Sebnem, if I can come to you, what would you say is the one big thing that stops young people from trusting politicians, or what, from your experience, have you seen or have you heard from other young people?
Thank you. I think it's the lack of hopelessness. So even if young people are able to attend places where they are supposedly being heard and listened to, there's no decisive action that is being taken. So to give an example, a few months ago, I attended an employment discussion hosted by the House of Lords, which I represented My Life, My Say at. And it was very clear that many of the young leaders there and young students had shared similar issues and similar problems with unemployment, finding jobs, the lack of skills they had. And even though there were many House of Lords members attending this event, after the event, there was no follow-up. So there was no action plan that they had promised to take. So you start to think, so what was the point of us sharing our experiences and sharing our struggle? So even though sometimes we have these opportunities to attend these events and these programs to share our ideas and our concerns, from our perspective especially, there's no follow-up from it. So we feel hopeless that we're not being heard and we're not taken serious enough.
Thank you, Sebnem. And Ines, if I can come to you, I mean, both yourself and Alexia is doing amazing work in terms of, with your initiative around Teens for Democracy and really trying to encourage make sure that teens have a voice in our political system. What do you think we can do more of within our schools, or to sort of get the conversation rolling? Is there any initiatives we can look at, or what you're doing at the moment?
First of all, within the education system, I think that it's important to, instead of just teach children and teenagers on how to involve themselves or the issues that occur in society, which in most schools in Greece at least we don't really talk about, but there should be more lessons on how to, not how to, but actually being able to involve yourself. Start with decisions that concern your school, then move on to community and even country, and use the education system as a tool to reach more people and involve them instead of just educating them. What we're doing now is the platform, which is going to involve teenagers, but the education system is a tool which we can use to involve more people. Amazing.
That's brilliant. And Diana, if I can come to you, I'm just looking at, having known the work that you're doing, particularly in London and UK, particularly to give young people a voice, what are some of the things that we can do to kind of enhance our democracy, to give young people more of a voice? I'm thinking it could be political education within our schools. Do you think it is votes to 16? Do we need to look at more digital means to think about how we engage young people? What are some of the solutions to that?
Sure. I think one key element is actually getting young people involved in co-designing these solutions. So specifically when something needs to be done, if this is like a government policy or government strategy, it's asking these young people, what do you think is needed and what do you think you would like to see? And from doing so, you'll be able to get young people's voices and actually create really successful campaigns that young people have been involved in and that young people really can contribute their ideas and thoughts. Often you find that sometimes these solutions and policies are made, but they don't actually consider young people's opinions. So by really doing so, you'll be able to get a different range of perspectives and also be able to make something that's accessible and useful for a lot of young people.
Amazing, thank you, Diana. Alexia, I want to come back to you on one final point on this specific round. Do you feel optimistic, or do you feel like, you're in the Athens Democracy Forum, right? We're surrounded by some of the most, influential people in the world of, politics who've come together in Athens. Do you feel like they genuinely do care about what you think?
That's a tough question. Well, youth has been vocal on issues that both adults and youth are involved in. Maybe adults are more in the policy-making part, but youth is interested. That is a fact. Now, adults and policymakers are starting to listen and see the efforts of youth, which can be expressed through demonstrations, protests, petitions, and even though we can say that social media might not always be a tool for democracy, it has helped teens and youth be more vocal. And that is why I am optimistic that at some point democracy will prevail, teens will be heard, and through maybe our platform and other youth-led initiatives, adults will see that there is a mass. We are the future, and they will see the future as an opinion that needs to be taken into consideration.
Absolutely, really good points. I want to start getting into sort of the detail about how we start to build trust between sort of young people and sort of decision makers. And Abba, if I can come back to you, what are some of the more practical things that you think we can do to build that trust that is currently seems to be sort of, because I think we're all in agreement that young people do care about issues. You see what young people are doing around climate change, particularly around Black Lives Matter as well. When we had last year, it was young black people who were leading the movement around that. So many other issues that you look in history as well. So how do we kind of bridge that gap? What are the practical things that we can do?
Yeah, for me, I think that there's two main things we can counter to this. Firstly, it's the fact that I think a lot of influential people or politicians as well, they're listening, but they're not hearing us. A lot of young people are talking about, for example, climate change or even the Black Lives Matter movement, equality. And I think it's really great to give all these young people forums or stuff to kind of talk about. But when we don't put it into actual tangible change, it's really difficult to do so. There should be young people that are actively in the decision making as well, because it's something that's affecting us. We've seen it even in the pandemic. And another part is, which actually coincides with what I just said now, is holding government accountable. A lot of time there are promises that they made or put through their manifesto which broke. We saw that especially during the pandemic in UK, where the government failed to respond to a lot of things they said they were going to do. And so I think that's very difficult for young people, to trust them, but also to kind of actually want to help in that decision making. But I think in terms of that, as long as the government is holding accountable, but also just actually listening to young people and talking to them about what do we actually want to change, or what do we actually want to implement, I think is a really a good way to kind of bridge that gap.
So if I was to flip that question back to you again and say, what would you say is the sort of biggest priority for you now as an individual or for your community that you feel like has been neglected for so long and they're just not listening or not getting sort of our voices?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I'm going back on both my identities, me as a woman and me also as a Black person. I think even the Black Lives Matter movement last year was a perfect example. There was a lot of people, activists as well, talking about these change, a lot of community organizers talking about the change they wanted to see in terms of promoting more education in schools and other like really pinnacle issues, but that was falling on deaf ears in the government, and that's a problem, because when we're fighting for equality, it should be something that's being pushed through the government more, and that was something that wasn't.
Amazing, great. I want us to like put democracy in action, and obviously, if we done this in a proper democracy cafe, would be have the tools to do it. But we're going to try to make it work. So we could see you on the screen. And obviously, both Ines and Alexia is next to me. So if I were to ask you all a question, if you just raise your hand, how many of you feel optimistic that we can rebuild that trust between young people and decision makers? Okay, so we've got 2 in the room and 3 no's online. So okay, we've got other people in the room who are voting as well. So great. And then how many of you feel optimistic about your future, just generally? Interesting. So we've got, for the viewers who are watching us online, we've got some physical presence there in the audience, and most of them feel more optimistic. But the young people on the panel, none of them have sort of expressed any optimism, which obviously is some of the cause for concern and why we're having this conversation. So Ines, I want to bring it back to you, particularly the work, as I say, I mean, I just find it absolutely fascinating that you're both here, age, 50, you're very young. And, when people say that young people don't care about politics or can't talk about politics, I think you're both living proof of actually how that is false. And actually, we do have lots of young people capable and able to lead if they're given the opportunity and platform. And I think that's why it's great what Athens Democracy Forum is doing. But Ines, if I could bring it back to you, what do you think we can do to rebuild that trust between, young people and some of the more traditional forms of institutions where we seem to sort of lack that connection?
I think that it's really important to have more transparency, and I know that everyone keeps saying that, but for it to actually happen, it's really hard. We do live in a time when there is more transparency because of technology, social media, and more things come to light. But because we have fake news, it's really hard to distinguish what is true and what isn't true. And that makes teenagers feel like they don't know what's happening, and how can they trust something, or how can they be involved in something if they don't know what is true and what is not. But then again, youth is trying to involve themselves, ourselves, in, by participating in protests or trying to involve themselves by petitions and everything they have the power to do. But I think that a key part to rebuild this trust is the education system, again, because it does have the power to reach people and it has accessibility. But it's not built right now. I mean, it hasn't changed that dramatically in 30 years when the entire world around us is revolutionary changing. So if we change the education system to match the pace of the world and to include more politics, to involve teenagers, then that will rebuild some trust in the government. But one last thing, there needs to be more representation of youth for youth to feel like they have a say and for youth to trust the government and politicians.
Absolutely, great points there. And Sebnem, if I can, come back to you, I think one of the things that Abba raised as part of her response, which she touched on, which was really important, is that people often talk about, how do you engage young people in politics? And I always say the question's wrong from the start because, you fail to recognize the different intersectionalities that exist within young people. We're not one big homogenous group. There are different ways to engage with different people, and you need to recognize those barriers that exist. So, as a young Muslim woman who's obviously been brought up in London or in the UK, what would you like to see, and what do you feel like, some of your identity is sort of taken into account when people are looking at how they can build that relationship with you, or do you just think you're just sort of seen as a number or another citizen in society?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the greatest concerns for Muslims in London, or in fact in the UK, is the rise in Islamophobia. And this has been fueled, especially with the pandemic, especially on social media, where the spread of disinformation has made the situation worse. Because, for example, a recent study showed that Muslims were blamed for the spread of COVID-19, and which led to the lockdown, because we were attending the mosques or the local community centres, which wasn't true at all. And that's very dangerous because disinformation actually translates to physical violence. So if we're not careful about that, and if there's no mechanisms to protect us and the minority groups in the UK or in any other country in the world, then obviously people, especially Muslims and ethnic minorities, are going to feel very scared to contribute to society and take part in decision-making processes, voicing their concerns, especially with for example, the hijab ban in France. So it's not, this problem of Islamophobia is not just within the UK, it's very prominent in other European countries as well. So rather than discriminating us, there needs to be policies in place that include us in the process and take into account our beliefs, and our way of life, and respect our rights, because me wearing the hijab and me practicing my religion is my right. It's my fundamental human right. So yeah, that's what I believe.
Thank you, Sebnem, for sharing that with us. And I want to pick up on something you spoke about, which is around disinformation. And we spoke a lot in the Athens Democracy Forum about, how people, how citizens sort of like gather their source of information, or where do you go to sort of look for news. And Diana, I'm going to come to you, but before I do, I want to come to Alexia quickly. Where do you go to, if you want to check up on the news, do you check traditional forms of media? Like, where's your go-to? Would it be social media? What would you do?
Well, I believe that fake news sources nowadays so closely mimic real ones that it's pretty much impossible to say that I'm 100% that this is an accurate news source. So the truth is that most of what I learn about the world is social media, through social media, because that's where first of all, I prefer learning news and learning current issues through teens, so that the only way that I can really do that is through social media. However, I need to cross-check everything that I read, so I do use more traditional news sources such as newspapers to really inform myself on what I really care about. Although, as I said before, I prefer learning about current issues through the eyes of a teenager, because that's what I can relate to.
Really great. And Diana, if I can come to you, I mean, again, we've spoken a lot about, building trust. We spoke about education. We spoke about disinformation and how we tackle that. I just wonder, in terms of like talking about building trust, going back to what we can do sort of practically sort of to build that trust, what is it that you would want to see? Because part of this is about leadership, right? It's about, when you're going out to vote or when you're going to get engaged, you want to be inspired by your leader. What is it that you look to see in your leader? What qualities would you like to see?
Sure. I think something that's definitely needed is a leader who really takes into account what young people need. So this will be useful specifically when like policies and different strategies are needed to be made. But one way this can be done is to ensure that we as young people get to hold these leaders accountable. So we get to challenge them, we get to ask them different questions, and they get to really sit down with us and ask, okay, this is what you want to see, what are the actions you want me to do, and how will I be able to implement this? And by doing so, will we actually be able to see some transformative change, and will like young people be able to see that this change that they want to see is happening, and slowly start building that trust that they want.
Amazing. And can I ask five of you a question? How many of you are potentially thinking to stand for maybe political office in the future?
Terrible question.
Yeah? No?
I don't know.
You should be putting yourself forward.
Maybe,
Of course you should.
Depends.
No? Why not,
It's a
Abba?
difficult one. I don't know.
Why is it a
because
difficult one?
because I think the institutions in itself are, especially the point of democracy that we mentioned before, even seeing it in, like, for example, Parliament in UK is quite difficult, because I don't know necessarily if me even though I'm quite vocal and I'm quite good with certain things of activism, I feel like it's quite difficult to translate that into political office. And I feel like sometimes when you're running or even being involved in that, you kind of maybe lose yourself a little bit. We've seen it with some politicians that had manifestos they said before, and then they went totally against it. So I personally don't know if I did that, I don't want to lose certain values that I have in that sense. I don't know if that one makes sense. I think I would do something in a political field, but I don't necessarily know if I would run for any elections or like be a candidate for any elections. I don't know if that makes sense. So yeah.
Yeah, no, and I understand why you would say that, because I think it's partly what, like Ines was talking about representation, for example, the lack of representation. And obviously, because we're used to a certain norm, and we've never seen people like you, Abba, like there isn't many people who look and sound like you who is in Parliament. Therefore, you don't see that as an avenue to think. But I just wonder whether it requires us to sort of take that step forward and say, do you know what, like, great, but we need to actually take leadership. So, Ines, what would you sort of respond to that? How do you think we need to encourage more young people to stand for public office? Or what do we need to do to support young people to run for public office?
Personally, I don't know if I would. Maybe I would, but I think that youth needs to trust institutions first and then be able to run for office. Maybe that's the order. But yes, because they need more representation, I think that youth does want to get involved in politics, and that can include running for office. But I agree with what was said, that you may lose yourself in the way. But again, I do think that, youth will run for office. Of course they will. I mean, it is their future, and they know that they need to take a stand in it. We need to do something about it, and being in office is one of the ways you can do that. So yes, definitely. And that can happen through encouraging them to take a stand politically, raising awareness, of course, but more, again, I'm going to say that again, but involving them now, so then they can they can feel more ready and they can they can run for office.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Ines. So I'm going to put you all on the spot. We've got 2 minutes left. And so it's just going to be one line and one sentence. And it's going to be, and I didn't brief you about this, so apologies for putting you on the spot. But what I want you to do is think about your own country and your own context. So if you say, if you were the Prime Minister for a day, what's the one thing that you would do? So, Abba, I'm going to kick off with you. If you were the Prime Minister for the day, what's the one thing you would change?
That is heavy. I didn't even have time to think about that. But if I was Prime Minister for the day, I would actually stick to the manifesto that I would. That's a bit of a shame. Stick to the manifesto. But I think for me, the main important things is youth engagement, and also climate change. Those are the two, and equality, because it's lacking. A representation is good and well, but you need to have the spaces that actually facilitate that change and facilitate those people that will be doing that. So those are, I don't know if that's really something, but yeah, that's what I would do. Create spaces that
Great. I'm
will
going to ask
engage
for
people
short
more. Yeah.
answers. Thank you, Abba. So just in one line, Alexia, I'll come to you next. Okay. What's the one thing you would do if you're the Prime? And it doesn't mean that, it's the only thing you would do, but what's the main priority for you, I guess?
Sure. I would try to have youth represented, and maybe I would do that, I don't know, maybe lowering the voting age. I would do that if I were the Prime Minister for a day. Amazing.
And Diana, very quickly to you, 10 seconds, what would you do?
I would make mental health services more accessible so you do not have to wait lots of months to actually be seen.
And Sebnem?
I would obviously fight discrimination because we see it play out in education, in housing, and in other parts of society.
And finally, Ines?
I would lower and expand the citizen threshold, so so more people would be heard.
So as you can see, these young people are extremely political and have a lot of opinions and have a lot to say about how we can rebuild society, especially as we come out of COVID. Thank you so much for joining our version of Democracy Cafe, or as I call it, Democracy Water, because I haven't got my coffee with me today. But this has been a great taster, and look, the courage that some of these young people have to come here in Athens Democracy Forum and speak in front of all these very important people is something that's very sort of admirable. So we should all give a massive round of applause for that.